When we encounter someone of a different race on the street, how do we react? Do we notice the feelings we have? And what is the impact on the people we interact with in our daily lives? Implicit or unconscious bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that can affect our understandings, actions, and decisions without us even realizing it. In order to create greater understanding, the American Leadership Forum has gathered people to explore the issue. Two senior fellows, Bill Kennedy and Cassandra Pye, join us to discuss this initiative and the tough but illuminating conversations this effort is generating. Next on Studio Sacramento.
At Five Star Bank, we create thoughtful solutions to help the Capital Region thrive, from economic development and education to public health and safety, issues that are vitally important to Sacramento's prosperity. We're proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
Cassandra, this notion of implicit or unconscious bias is connected up to discussions related to race. Why in 2017 is it still so difficult to have candid, forthright discussions on race?
It's a great way to start this conversation. Scott, either I am on the receiving end and get defensive because I'm assuming that you think I'm a racist if we're in the midst of a conversation about race, or just the opposite. I'm a person of color and I'm defensive about whether or not I trust you or trust your opinions or that you're being honest with me. And so a lot of the conversation around race winds up being emotional. What's been fascinating and I think rewarding about the way we've had the conversation about bias is it's science-based. Once you start to understand the way the brain works, once you understand that that's a fact, it takes the emotion out of the conversation and you really focus on the science and how complex that brain of yours is, and then you start to listen. That's why ALF thought it was important to pull together these 60 or so fellows to have a conversation about bias, and it was far more rewarding.
This conversation has been taking place for over what period of time?
Took place over a period of 6 sessions, 60 fellows, separate sessions. There was a Monday and a Wednesday session, and we had roughly 30 fellows in each session. All the diversity that you would expect with ALF in terms of background as well as sectors. And so it was a fascinating conversation, but most importantly, it was science-based.
Bill, what is the science basis that Cassandra is describing?
Well, first we should start by acknowledging that 90% of what we know about the brain we've learned in the last 40 years, because prior to that we had no instruments that could measure brain function as well as we can today. So we've learned many things about the brain, such as the conscious mind processes as many as 40 different bits of information every second. And that seems amazing until you understand that the subconscious part of the brain in the same second is processing 11 million bits of information. Essentially, what we become conscious of is delivered through a subconscious pathway, which is where implicit bias or unconscious bias resides.
Give us an example of this unconscious way of dealing with things.
Well, since we're talking about race, one thing that is particularly challenging in our society today is that 75% of people in this country who have taken an implicit association test associate young African American men with crime. That happens before we even consciously think about it. That association is already solidly there. Now, the reasons for that are many, but what it does is before we become conscious in our thoughts, we already have loaded into our mind this association. That association can be quite pernicious and may be one of the reasons that our criminal justice system seems to have such disparate outcomes.
Now, this science of studying that we're sort of hardwired to automatically program ourselves to react to certain things. This isn't just related to race, it's in everything in life?
In everything. You may be hardwired to like apples better than oranges. That is, in fact, a bias. You may be conscious of it, you may not be conscious of it. Or, like, an example could, you may claim you like oranges better than apples, but if we watch you, you're always buying apples. That means your bias is unconscious and you're not, in fact, acting consistent with your consciously held beliefs.
Is it also the way that, like, we do normal things, the way we tie our shoes, the way that we drive a car or something like that, where we just kind of do it?
It becomes habit, yes. When you were young, you learned how to walk. You learned how to scout the surface that you were walking through, and you made decisions about where to place your feet, and you balanced, and from time to time you would trip over something, and then you would have to readjust those things. But you don't think about walking. When we're done here, you're going to get up and walk out of the studio, and you're not going to run into anything. You will be making decisions all the way, but you will not be aware of them because you don't need to be.
And that's what we do with implicit or unconscious bias.
Yes, it is. What we do is we load associations with different people based on type, sometimes based on race, sometimes based on gender, sometimes based on nativity, sometimes based on LGBTQ issues. We assign different associations which can lead to attitude and can lead to, it can affect the manner in which I'm going to talk with you or have an interchange with you. I might be warm and compassionate, or I might see you as the other, in which case I'm going to keep my distance. The quality of our interchange is going to be affected by those factors.
So why does this matter, though?
You've asked a question that can only be answered on many levels, but I think it matters because we have values that say we will treat people and give people opportunity that is equivalent. We can't do that if we're not aware of what's going on in our subconscious mind. So the magic of the lessons that we've learned through ALF and working with Cassandra and ALF is that what we know is these unconscious associations and attitudes are discoverable, they're malleable, and in fact, with the plasticity of the brain, they can be changed. So if we can, in fact, fix this, why not?
Well,
So let me add one thing. If you don't believe it, you asked us to think about sharing some resources with you. If you've not done so, and if your viewers have not done so, absolutely positively go on to harvard.edu and take an implicit association test. There are plenty of them. As Bill says, they're not just about race, they're about any number of things that we might hold biases about, but they are scientifically based. It is a resource that you can use for free. And one of the things that Bill and I insisted on in the course of the conversations is that before we launched into too much of the dialogue about bias, we insisted that the fellows that took these, that sat in on the sessions, take 1 or 2 IATs before they came to session, just so that they would see what their own. And we told them you could keep it to yourself if you want to.
That's interesting. That's interesting to me because some might say that this is just the old retired hash of victimology, from that old wineskin poured into a new bottle with a new term wrapped around it so that people who want to press a particular political agenda can do so. How do you respond to that?
My response to that is that you can't deny the science. And my other response to that has to do with the first question you asked, and that is most of the time when we sit down to a table to have a conversation about race, and it's a white person and people of color, somehow we always get to that term racist. Being biased is anything but being a racist.
Oh, stop there.
Okay.
Explain that, because you just lost me.
Well, if I'm sitting down with Bill and we're having a conversation about race, and I call Bill a racist and say that Bill's treated me a certain way or talked to me a certain way or made assumptions about me because he's a racist, Bill's going to get defensive. And I've also made I've made a hard I've called it pretty much as I think I see it. being racist is not the same thing as being biased. Racist is one thing. Bias happens naturally. We are all biased. I'm an African American woman, and I am biased.
We are all
We are
biased.
all biased. We all have our own
Okay,
biases.
so I got to ask you both this question. Years ago, I remember the director Spike Lee said, okay, black people can't be, in his case, he used the word racist, but I believe that implicit in that is the word biased, because of the fact that racism and bias is a system. So therefore, it's impossible for a person of whatever that extraction is, and forgive me, Bill, but let's be clear, it's always an abstraction away from a white male, cannot be biased or racist in any way. So speak to that.
Bill has a great slide where he calls out sort of what racists look like and what racism looks like, and then follows that up with, they're very, there's sort of this viewpoint of racists, and they're mean and they're angry, and they, go and do mean and ugly and angry things based on race. Very few people really fall into that category. What we act on, as Bill has said, the science demonstrates, are things that just happen naturally and unconsciously in our brains every day.
So do we automatically go to Dylan Roof and say, okay, everyone who I perceive is treating me in a way that is discriminatory or holds certain opinions, they're Dylan Roof, but really that's truly the outlier exception?
That is the outlier exception. And I think that in order for us to learn to talk about race, we need to be very clear on terms. And racist is a loaded term. Racist is usually a conversation ender. There are racists. Dylan Roof, I think, is a racist. He's a white supremacist racist. He models everything we know in our history about that. But that is not the sum total of the racial isolation or the causes of racial isolation. So we have racism as, we understand racism as hate, as in the Dylan Roof situation. But we have to understand racism as structures. There are structures that have existed for years, structures like Social Security, structures like the GI Bill, where 90%, for 40 years, 90% of those benefits went to white men. Even though others were available, they couldn't use those benefits. Those are structures which result in disparate outcomes. We have implicit bias. We have a culture where a white person is generally at the center of every discussion. That sends subliminal messages of value. We need to be aware of those messages, and we need to be aware of that's impact. We know that we have culture. One slide that I share is over 90% of protagonists in video game adventure games are white males in their 30s. And then we have perhaps what I think the most pernicious type of racism. And all 5 of these need to be discussed. And that is those who use race to divide in order to create power or to money. If I can make you afraid of someone who looks like me, I might be able to sell you a security system.
Well, isn't that as American as mom and apple pie? I want to read you something that was written about by author Nancy Eisenberg last summer in the Washington Post. Class power takes many forms in its enduring force and ability to project hatred toward lower classes, and it was best summed up by 2 presidents 175 years apart. In 1790, then Vice President John Adams argued that Americans not only scrambled to get ahead, but they needed someone to disparage. There must be one, indeed, who is the last and the lowest of the human species. Lyndon Johnson, 175 years later, came to the same conclusion in explaining the racism of poor whites. If you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him someone to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you. So these are two presidents separated by almost the span of our nation's history. And when you hear that, what's your reaction based on the research and the work that you've done?
Well, my initial reaction is that our brains are complex, and in times of stress, in times of struggle, quite often we do things to protect ourselves, which is to divide. We divide the world into in-groups and out-groups. We feel compassion for in-groups. We do not feel compassion for out-groups. What they're saying, I think, is a form of manipulation. I mean, Hermann Goering said it's easy to get people to go to war.
The Nazi German propagandist.
Yes. He said it's easy to get people to go to war. You just create somebody to fear and tell them that their rights are being threatened, and they will follow you anywhere you take them. But I want to get to the point that you're raising, which is, just to paraphrase a quote from another great mind, Albert Einstein, who was a particle physicist, of course, and he said that human beings are part of a whole called humanity, part of the universe. We relate only to those people who are nearest to us, those people like us, but that is not the way of the world, because we are indeed all connected. That our job in life is to break down those boundaries and to in fact expand our relationship, because that is in fact what science tells us. We are in fact all connected.
I hear you when you say that, but at the same time, there are those who say that if we didn't have race, gender, orientation, or any of the other things that automatically come to mind, we'd find something else. Because, for instance, during the mid-1990s, when there was the Bosnian War, when the former republics or components of Yugoslavia broke up and started to go to war with each other, they were killing each other, and they were all Caucasian. And so while in this country there seems to be a centuries-old issue with related to race, human beings are always finding ways to divide themselves. Isn't that just part of the human existence?
It could be, but I also think that what Bill is getting to is where I'd like to get to, and that is, if we are interconnected and we do find ways to spend more time with each other, with people who are not like us, that starts to break down those barriers and those biases. I want to step back to something both of you talked about, again, with respect to race. What I found fascinating about this conversation is, again, to me, it turned the whole discussion of race literally and figuratively on its head, in that if we're having a conversation about race and I call you a racist and you say, but I'm not a racist, then I keep going on. I keep moving on and sort of making decisions, biased decisions, about my business, about resources, about property, about all those things that matter to quality of life, because I've kind of checked out. You called me a racist, I'm not a racist, I don't want to talk about it. But if I know that I'm biased and there's science behind that, then I start to think about where that plays, where those biases that are inherent and naturally occurring, where they make me make decisions that impact people that are different than me.
Let's go there.
Okay.
Share with us how, in these conversations, from the people that participated when they walked in, and you shared with them these learnings and this methodology and the science, how they evolved over the span of these conversations.
I want to make it personal, if I could. I said this to Bill many times. We were having this conversation in the course of a time in our American history where we were in a very, very heated presidential election with a lot of hate speak, a lot of vitriol, a lot of loud noise. We were also, right around the time that we launched these discussions, we had just witnessed yet another police-involved shooting of a black man here in Sacramento. But we'd had a string, as you both know, a series of events like that, which had a lot of people on edge walking in the door. I'll speak for myself personally. I said this to Bill, I don't think I could have made my way through the election without better understanding the brain and my brain and the way the brain works for a lot of the people that were doing that screaming and shouting.
What did you learn about you?
I learned that I can't have a conversation about race that's going to solve anything. I have to have conversations about biases and help people understand theirs, help me understand mine, and figure out ways to de-bias people, myself, and then starting there, work our way into institutions. Decisions get made most of the time not because of racism, I've come to learn as a part of this process, but more because of these implicit associations we make. And it really, lots of the fellows said this, the word life-changing was used in evaluations more than once for just that reason.
Bill, what did you learn about yourself?
Well, I'm constantly learning about the biases that I have. I will share one anecdote which I think demonstrates it. I love my wife. We've been married 30 years tomorrow. She's a beautiful Asian American woman. And so I take the implicit association tests all the time, basically to check my own bias. And sometimes I want to take one where I don't think I will feel so badly at the end. So I took I wanted to find out what my associations are with Asian people. And it turns out that I'm moderately inclined to believe they are not American. So I talked to, that they're foreigners, and understand, this is my wife, this is my son. I talked to my family over Thanksgiving once and said, I took this test. This is what I found out. How can this possibly be? And so my brother-in-law said, yeah, well, all you white people do that. Treat us as if we're not Americans. I was mortified. I will never sit down with an Asian American person as a client or without being very much aware of that. I will never sit down with a young African American man understanding that without consciously checking at the door my association with crime, that I might make a judgment that is not based upon fact. So what we have here is a new way to have conversations and a new way to learn, starting with our own bias, but then looking at our institutions. If we chart decision-making processes in our institutions, we can identify where bias lies, and there are 17 interventions which you can use.
Perfect example, one of our fellows works in the environmental space in a nonprofit that does environmental work, and said that they do almost no recruiting in communities of color because they've sort of had this bias about people of color caring about the environment or being environmentally, proactive or activists. So that was interesting.
I'm curious, who wasn't in the room that you expected to be in the room when you're having these conversations?
Well, that's also a very good question. The groups were predominantly white, and they were very heavy female. There were very few African Americans or Latinos.
Do you have a theory on why that is?
I do. I think in most cases, I'll speak for people for African Americans, they're tired. I think we're tired. I think we get tired of talking about race. I think if more knew that we were not talking so much about race and more about bias, that we'd have more people show up for the conversation. But as we said up front, people get defensive. They feel like they're going to be tailored as racist or that they're going to have to instruct the class on what the Black experience or the Latino experience is like. And I don't think that there was a great appetite for that.
Bill, why did you all take on race as opposed to gender, orientation, or anything else to start these conversations on bias?
Well, as you know, I'm an attorney, and I filed discrimination claims for 40 years until it became impossible to do so, because embedded in the law are assumptions which are generally not true. The assumptions are that people are consciously aware of all the decisions they make. So the clients that I represented, from African-American Marines in Camp Pendleton to farm workers in the Central Valley, there was always bias manifest, but I couldn't prove it because the law did not recognize the science. So 15 years ago, I learned about the science to start incorporating that into the laws to revive our civil rights.
And we're going to leave it there.
Okay.
And that's our show. Thanks to our guests and thanks to you for watching Studio Sacramento. I'm Scott Syphax. See you next time right here on KVIE.
At Five Star Bank, we create thoughtful solutions to help the Capital Region thrive, from economic development and education to public health and safety, issues that are vitally important to Sacramento's prosperity. We're proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
All episodes of Studio Sacramento, along with other KVIE programs, are available to watch online at kvie.org/video.